Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I know a few people will come in a little later, and that's just fine. We're glad that you are with us today. My name is Marcy Glass. I'm one of the pastors here at Calvary, and thank you for joining us in Book Passage today for this conversation with Lisa Sharon Harper. I'd like to begin our presentation with a land acknowledgement. Calvary acknowledges that we are on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. As the indigenous stewards of this land, and in accordance with their traditions, the Ramaytush Ohlone have never ceded, lost, nor forgotten their responsibilities as the and we wish to pay our
literally for a decade. So I know Aunt Kizzy is my Aunt Kizzy, y'all. So we would watch that Roots, and we would connect with with the ancestors through Alex Haley's work. And that, I think, is really what planted the seeds for this book, the book Roots. You see that Wade in the Water piece, my mom would sing that. And there was a concert in the 1980s where Sweet Honey in the Rock sang Wade in the Water. And they explained in their concert that song was a song that was sung as enslaved people knew that somebody was about to run that night. And they would sing that song in the fields or that night as the person was about to run. And it was a warning, go to the water, because the dogs can't smell you in the water. And I never understood why would that even be a thing, but imagine never being able to take a bath or a shower. You're going to have some kind of smell. So you have to go to a place where the dogs can't smell you, and the water was the place. But the thing about that water was that it was troubled water. In the water was alligators and water moccasins and malaria-ridden mosquitoes. And so in order for the ones who wanted to reach freedom, they had to go through the troubled waters. And Sweet Honey in the Rock said that if we want to get to freedom as a nation, if we want to get beyond the things we've already known, we want to get to the other side, to experience a different kind of living, we're going to have to go through the troubled waters. And what I say is that those troubled waters are real today. We have troubled waters. Our nation has troubled, the church has troubled waters right now. We have alligators of our own. We have water moccasins of our own. We have malaria-ridden mosquitoes of our own. But if we, church, if we are to get to that freedom land, to the beloved community, to shalom, then we must reckon with the truth of what happened. We have to. Otherwise, we will never get to the other side. And we will always be teetering on the brink. And we may even see another war. But we have a choice. We can dabble our feet in the water and walk away, or we can walk through. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to walk through some water. We're going to reckon. And I wanted to share with you some of the history as it interacted with my own family, because I think it's an easier way in some ways for us to, or maybe not easier, but it's a more palpable way for us to take it in, is through the context of personal story. Right? This is not just something that happened out here. This is something that really happened to people, and it had real impact. So, are you ready to go with me? All right, let's go. So, 1630, we're going all the way back. 1630, a young girl is born, and her name is Elizabeth Key. Elizabeth Key is born in the colony of Virginia, and her father is Thomas Key. He's actually a member of the House of Burgesses in Virginia. And Thomas has been forced by his colony to recognize Elizabeth as his own, even though she is half black and half white. So hear me. This was the product likely of rape. Actually, it was the product of rape, because the person who was Elizabeth's mother was an enslaved woman who was enslaved to Thomas. Now, the colony forced him to recognize Elizabeth as his daughter and to have her baptized. So now, flip forward about 24 years. She's about 24 years old, and Elizabeth she's starting to learn the law. I mean, look, her dad was a member of the House of Burgesses, the legislature. And so she's starting to get it. And she takes her case to court because on the basis of three pieces of truth. One, in the British colonies, citizenship was passed through the line of the father. And citizenship prevented one from being able to be enslaved. So, according to English law, you could not enslave another British citizen. You hear me? And third, common law said you could not enslave another Christian. So she was like, hello? You should not be able to be enslaving me. So I need to be set free. So she took her case to court, and she won. And then after her came the stream of more people who were in that same situation, because it was a very common situation to have a British father and an enslaved mother, because rape of their enslaved African women was so common because it gave them free labor. But this had not yet been legislated. The status of these children was really questioned. And that's part of the reason why a few years after Elizabeth won her case and people start taking their cases to court and winning, the House of Burgesses, who is the planter class, they all started to get their pearls in a bunch and just said, wait a minute, we have this free labor leaving our plantations now. Now, they had a choice at that moment. They could, at that moment, have chosen to move their indentured servitude and enslaved economy into a true capitalist society. They could have said, you know what, we're going to start paying people. We're going to move from having free labor to having paid labor. But guess what? This is going to pay into our economy. We're going to grow our economy. People are going to be able to buy more things. It's going to work for all of us. They did not do that. What do you think they did? Instead, what they did was they shifted where citizenship came from. And they said, hereby, to forevermore, citizenship shall come through the line of the mother. And then they added the two words that created race-based slavery in American history: in perpetuity. So no longer would it be that, okay, you're indentured, you have to pay off your debt, and then you get set free at a particular time, and for whatever reason, this other person in the same family is now enslaved and has no debt, but they are enslaved, but their kids' status will be questioned. No. If you are an enslaved woman, you are black. That's just the way that it was. They were the ones who were enslaved. And if you are enslaved, you are definitely not a citizen. And now your children and your children's children and your children's children's children to the 1,000th generation and beyond shall now become enslaved as well. So who does this benefit? The planter class that's creating the law, right? So now, 2 years after that, Maryland, the colony, the second colony, it's the second British colony, they perceive a problem on the ground as well. And it's the exact opposite. It's the flip side of the coin of the Virginia problem. The Virginia problem was the confusion of the caste system that was coming up because of white men raping enslaved black women, and then having mixed race kids. Well, in Maryland, it was white women who were coming from Ireland, Northern Ireland mostly. Either they were Irish or they were Ulster Scot, and they were indentured on plantations right alongside enslaved black men. And they were falling in love. And they were having those men's children and getting married to them. And this did two things to the planter class in Maryland. It, again, confused the racial caste system that they had been developing, and it bruised their egos. Come on, let's be real. And so what did they do? How did they respond? They responded by creating this law 2 years after the Virginia law. If a white woman marries and has the children of an enslaved black man, then she too will be enslaved by her husband's master until her husband's death. And her children shall be enslaved in perpetuity. to the 1,000th generation and beyond. So let's just ask the question, who is actually really white in this equation? Who is really white? Men, exactly. And by white, we don't mean who is light-skinned, right? So I hope you're getting this, right? This is now becoming a political construct, as in it is answering the question of how the polis will live together. That's all politics is, right? So in the answering of the question of how the polis will live together, the ones at the top of the hierarchy of human belonging, in these seedlings of what brought us the world today, were white men. And white women, as long as they supported their white men. But if they didn't support their white men, their whiteness was revoked. It really was. Like, by law. Okay? So, into this context, just 23 years later, Fortune is born. Oh, I went backwards instead of forward. So Fortune is born. Fortune Gaye McGee is born 1687. She is born to Maudlin McGee, who is Ulster Scot, and Sambo Game. Sambo is a Wolof name from Senegal, and it means second son. And Maudlin came over at about 1682 with her husband, George McGee, also Ulster Scot. Both of them were indentured. Sambo was brought over on a slave ship circa 1686. Actually, I pretty much identified the slave ship he came over on because there weren't that many ships coming at that time, so it's really the only possible one. Captain Goodhand, about 200 and so enslaved people from that region of Senegal, Mali, Guinea, that little area, were boarded upon the Speedwell on the Gambia River and brought to the U.S., brought to the colony of Maryland. Sometime, very soon after he got here, he met Maudlin, they fell in love, and they had an affair. And the product of that affair was Fortune. And because Maudlin was white and Sambo was black, and they were in Maryland, their relationship fell squarely in the crosshairs of the very first race law in Maryland. But the way that the law shook out, by the time that Fortune is standing before a court in 1705, it had gone through some iterations. And the way that it shook out by then is that if Fortune's mother was white, then she could not be enslaved, but she would be indentured. And if her father was black, she would definitely be indentured. That was the way that the law went. And the question of how long the indenture would go would be in terms of whether or not they were married. If they were married, then her indenture would be 21 years. If they were not married, her indenture would be 31 years. Now, she was born at a moment when she actually should not have been able to be indentured or enslaved at all. She was kind of in this revoking moment when there was no law governing it for quite some time. But post haste, they hauled her into court, and she was then indentured until she turned 31. Indentured to the house of Mary Day. Mary Day was an aristocrat. She was a noblewoman who actually married into some money, but she also was granted a ton of land by Lord Baltimore, the son of the original Lord Baltimore, who actually kind of established Maryland. And so I went to the land, and this actually, I believe, is the land that Fortune lived on. I think she actually lived in this house, along with her daughters for several generations. It's Game Road, right there, named after Sambo Game. Now, it was always kind of surprising to me and kind of baffling. Why on all of the court records that we see for Fortune, for her daughter Sarah, why do we never see a husband listed? What's going on with that? One of my friends looked at that and said, is she in a brothel? Like, what's going on with that? I didn't know. And then I got curious and I decided to do one of those, just a rudimentary DNA matching, like just to say, are there surnames in me, right? Like, is the surname of her indenturers or Sarah's indenturers inside of me? Because if they are, there's a good chance that there was something foul going on. So I did just a rudimentary match, and it turns out their surnames are in me. So it's a good chance that Fortune was raped repeatedly by her indenturing owners, and her daughter was also raped repeatedly by her indenturing owners. And this tells us that this was systematic. This was actually, it had become the seeds of what we now understand to be breeding farms. It was the indenturers themselves who were breeding new free labor for themselves by raping the help. I want to tell you about Leah Ballard. Leah Ballard was the last enslaved woman in our family. Leah was enslaved in South Carolina. In South Carolina, that's a colony that actually became a colony. I keep doing that. I'm going to turn this around. There we go. So it became a colony to be a slave colony. I don't know if you knew that, but South Carolina, its existence started as a place for slavocracy on this soil that we call the United States now. And so that's where she was enslaved. We believe that she was actually brought south from Virginia by the Ballard family, which at one point in Virginia were Quaker, but they moved south in order to be able to enslave people. And they became one of the founders, a founding family of Camden, South Carolina. Now, there's a story in our family that says that Leah had 17 children. 17. That's a lot of children. It also wasn't necessarily that unusual at that time in the world. People had a lot of children. But the thing is, we could only ever find 12 of them on the census after the Civil War. I mean, all 12 of her children that are listed on the census in 1880 were all born after the Civil War, or as the Civil War was closing. So what about the first years, the first of her, her most potent birthing years? Where are those children? And where are the other 5 children that are in the family story? Well, as I did my research, I found out that one of 3 things happened, at least. One, they could have died, because 1 in every 3 children who was enslaved in South Carolina died. 1 in every 3. If they were in the Low Country, they died before their first year, their first birthday. If they were in the High Country where Leah was, it was before their 16th birthday, but they died. The other 2/3 could have been sold away just into the deeper South, or they could have been gifted to family members, like you would gift a bed, in a will, and then traveled into a deeper part of the South. We don't know. But that is the crux of the sin of enslavement, was the separation of families and the not knowing. Because at the heart of what it means to be human, at the heart of human dignity, is a sense of belonging. It is belonging. And so part of the system of slavocracy was to crush the sense of belonging in the owned. And how better to do that than to crush the family structure altogether? And so it is a miracle that we had Black families that survived and actually thrived after the Civil War. Somehow we did it. We made it. In fact, what happened out of that history came something beautiful and redemptive. We understand family, I think, even better than anybody else, because we began to cobble together what we now call fake family, right? We got our fake auntie, our fake uncle, we have our half-sister, our half-brother, step-sister, but all of them are family. The auntie who is not your auntie is your auntie. Your mama, who it doesn't bear any DNA with you, is your mama and has authority in your life because we had to. There was a lot of loss in Leah's life. A lot. But I want to focus for a moment on the day that she learned that she was free. And I imagine that on this day that there was a lot of dancing and jubilee that happened. But let me read for you from the last page of her chapter in the book, Fortune. Leah Ballard Ancrum Williams was a woman for whom the putrid taste of antebellum loss had become familiar. That loss followed Leah throughout her first 19 years, and its ghost haunted her in every generation till the day she died. The same year that Leah gave birth to Martha, my second great-grandmother, our nation pushed the 13th Amendment from passage to ratification within 12 months. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. These words catalyzed the reversal of the original Virginia laws established in 1662. As well as every race law that bound Fortune and her descendants, the laws that bound Henry, my second great-grandfather, and his brothers, who all fought in the Civil War and lived, and the South Carolina laws that shackled generations of Leah's family and would have bound them forever. I can only imagine Leah's tears and dancing on the day she learned she was free. To think of the joy now, my body cannot contain it. Leah would taste loss again. But for this moment, I imagine Leah standing still on the land that she and her people had slaved for generations. And on the day she hears that she is free, Leah raises her face to the noonday sun. She looks up to the trees, the leaves blowing and swaying overhead. And Leah remembers the sound of the spirit songs in the brush arbor. She remembers her mother's voice in the trees. She listens close, and soon she hears the harmonies of her foremothers all the way back to the Yoruba and the House of Women. And they sing to her from the trees. Put on your crown, child. Put on your crown. I came this night for to sing and pray, oh yes, to drive old Satan far away, oh yes, that heavenly home is bright and fair, oh yes, but very few can enter there, oh yes, oh wait till I put on my crown, wait till I put on my crown, wait till I put on my crown, oh yes. Now if you want to catch that heavenly breeze, oh yes, go down in the valley on your knees, oh yes, go bow your knees upon the ground, oh yes, and ask your Lord to turn you around, oh yes, wait till I put on my robe, wait till I put on my robe, wait till I put on my robe, oh yes. Did you hear it? Did you catch it? Enslaved men and women were singing this song in the fields. They were singing this song in the brush arbor as worship in church. They were singing about the crown that they deserved. They were singing about the robe that they deserved. They were singing the first page of the whole Bible. Because on that first page, it tells us that all humanity is made in the image of God. And what the people who heard that would have understood is that all humanity is imbued with the same dignity that we would usually only bestow upon a king or a queen. Enslaved women, and men understood that. They just needed the world to catch up with their understanding. I want to share with you now about my ancestors, Reynaldo y Anita. Reynaldo y Anita were born, let me see if I can do this right. They were born in Anguilla and also in St. Kitts, Nevis. But they came to America, circa 1920s, they started to come to America by way of Puerto Rico. They had been in Puerto Rico for many years. They got married in Puerto Rico, actually. And that's where my grandfather, Austin Weeks, was born. And that was great confusion in our family over this. But in my research, what I found was that they lived in the area of Santurce. Now, Santurce was an area that was kind of a welcoming place for Black Caribbeans that were looking for a kind space after abolition throughout the Caribbean. And they came to Puerto Rico because Puerto Rico had been settled by the Spanish, and some of the Spanish conquistadors who settled Puerto Rico were actually African. And so it happened to have a much more welcoming space for people who were Black. So they came in droves, and Santurce was one of those places they came to. That's where my ancestors lived, in Santurce. In the midst of Puerto Rico's annexed and crumbling economy, Reynaldo Weeks found work in the capital, San Juan. By 1923, he was a Black servant, likely working in the household of a white land baron or politician. Situated solidly at the bottom of Puerto Rico's racialized hierarchy and an era permeated by eugenics theory at a time when Jim Crow America won the Spanish-American War and consequently claimed Puerto Rico as its own. In this era, Reynaldo married Anita de Richardson, a Black maid from Anguilla, on April 5th, 1923. They lived in Santurce, near San Juan, with their 9-year-old son, Austin, my grandfather. Austin communed around a bomba drum with his Santurce neighbors, all of them annexed Americans without the full rights of citizenship. He watched adults dance out the oppression heaped upon their Black bodies by San Juan's white ruling class. He bore witness as his neighbors offered their bodies to the bomba beat for cleansing, for healing. Santurce is one of 3 major hubs of Black culture and community life at the northeastern coast of Puerto Rico, along with Carolina y Loíza. Much like South Philadelphia was the first northern destination for freed men and women in the post-Civil War era, Santurce became a primary destination for emancipated people throughout the Caribbean. When Reynaldo and Anita returned home from serving their white masters each day, they likely returned to a wooden home built on stilts atop Santurce swampland. According to their marriage certificate, Reynaldo y Anita lived on Calle Loíza Street, a main boulevard that flooded each time it rained and washed out when hurricanes passed over. And I imagine my little grandfather sitting cross-legged on the floor at Reynaldo's feet, huddled in a room with fellow Caribbean migrant neighbors. The rhythm of Santurce's bomba sica, walking is what it means, bomba, walking, filling the air like a Black man's strut. The rhythm has a groove, a swagger, an elegance. It reminds me of my grandfather. Black Puerto Ricans under Jim Crow rule could not determine where they would live, where they would work, how much their labor would be worth, and they could not protect their bodies from exploitation or molestation. They were subject to the racialized boundaries placed on housing, vocation, and rights. But in the bomba circle, the beat beckoned their bodies to move at will, where they will, how they willed. In the bomba, the men could plant their feet where they wanted for as long as they wanted. The women could shake their hips how they wanted. The dancers could freeze when they wanted, and the women would extend their arms like eagle's wings, gripping their handmade crinolines, and they could move each side as if telling the story of their soul's triumph that day. With each beat, chests faced sky as shoulders bounced and arms pounded air, compelled by the drum. The bomba is pure power and dignity, exercised by people stripped of both. They pounded out their pain in the midst of the community, encircled and supported by all. My mother, Sharon Lawrence, grew up in redlined South Philadelphia. She was born in 1948, just 3 years after the World War II, and her father and uncles all fought in World War II. Lots of postcards from the war, even in Germany. In the chapter on Sharon, we see the impacts of redlining on education. We see the impacts of redlining on social networks and capacity. We see the impacts of northern redlining on identity and the survival tactics of our ancestors who moved north into that space from the south and found the same white supremacy, just in different form. And you see, in 1933, the FHA loans actually created those redlined areas. A good book to read on that would be The Color of Law. I want to read, though, to you from a section that is actually about Sharon's involvement in the civil rights movement, because one of the things that she did was she fought back, and she joined the steady stream of people who were fighting. She was too young to march on Washington or too young to be there in Selma, but the minute that she graduated, she was a part of it, and that was 1966, the year after Selma. One day in 1965, shortly after Selma's Bloody Sunday, Sharon and her best friend Linda rode the bus north on 16th Street, en route to Philadelphia Community College, where they planned to complete 2 years before transferring to Temple University. But Sharon saw two young men mounting a sign that read SNCC Philadelphia at the entrance of 521 16th Street, which is literally down the street and around the corner from where we live right now. Sharon and Linda got off at the next stop and ran back to the sign. SNCC was opening its first northern office in Philadelphia, and they saw organizers and staff. Fresh out of high school, my mother became the church outreach organizer for SNCC's Philadelphia office. She was trained by Diane Nash, James Farmer, Stokely Carmichael, among others, and befriended SNCC members like Ruby Sales while attending SNCC's first summer training in Atlanta, 1966. Now, on June 5th, 1966, James Meredith, whose body had absorbed the trauma of the University of Mississippi riot when he integrated its campus 4 years before, set out on a one-man march against fear from Memphis, Tennessee, to Jackson, Mississippi. Meredith wanted to encourage Black Mississippians to register to vote, and he was shot down on day 2. Veteran Mississippi SNCC organizer Charles McLaurin recruited and partnered with Martin Luther King Jr. and SNCC's new chairperson, Stokely Carmichael, to pick up Meredith's march and finish in his name. Midway through the journey, McLaurin scouted a location in Greenwood, Mississippi, where the group could camp out overnight without harassment from local police. Tucked inside a close-knit Black community, Broad Street Park became the staging ground for Carmichael's most consequential speech. Organizers rode a pickup truck to the edge of the park. Carmichael had been picked up by local police and detained earlier that day. He had just returned to the park when organizers called him to the truck, hoisted him up onto the flatbed, and passed him the microphone. And he called the crowd to courage. "Don't let them scare you when you start opening your mouth. Speak the truth. Now, after admonishing the crowd to love their blackness, to define themselves, to reject the white view of blackness, and to instead to set the standards for all, Carmichael's voice raised with his fist as he zeroed in on the heart of the matter. We got to get us some black power. We don't control anything but what white people say we can control. We have to be able to smash any political machine in the country that is oppressing us and bring it to its knees. Now, Carmichael's call for black power was immediately interpreted by many whites as a foreboding threat of violence or a call to become anti-white. It was neither. Carmichael, who later renamed himself Kwame Ture, seemed to cut time in half with his cry for black power. Because you see, before that moment, people of African descent had lived under the hegemony of whiteness for 304 years. When the first race laws were passed in Virginia in 1662, and that hegemony told us we were not human. We were not beautiful. We were not meant to determine our own movement or family structures or language or religion or future. We were not meant to steward land, only to work it for the benefit of whites. We were meant to be ruled. We were created by God to lick white men's boots, make them shine, and like it. We were not even meant to have boots. And this was the theological lie. According to Genesis 1:26 and 27, if a person is human, they are created by God with the call and the capacity to steward the world, to make decisions that impact the world. The core sin of people of European descent has been to claim exclusive right to humanness, and thus the exclusive right to steward the world. Carmichael's call was rebellion against the lie. It was a clarion call It was a clarion call for people of African descent to embrace their blackness and their humanness, to embrace the truth that white people are not God. They are merely human. They do not get to determine the boundaries of beauty. They do not get to determine the boundaries of black flourishing. They do not get to shape our views of ourselves. We determine our worth. We determine the boundaries of our own flourishing. We determine how we will view ourselves. And this self-determination is not limited to the realm of cultural and social discourse. If we are human, then we are created to flourish and exercise agency in the world, economic and political, as well as social and cultural agency. So, beloveds, the question now is, how do we repair what race broke in the world? Because you see, it broke it. You can see race, this construct, this political construct that was designed to determine how the polis would live together, broke us. So what is it going to take? It's going to take first truth-telling. Truth-telling as reckoning. Now, truth-telling takes three things at least. It takes truth-seeking, truth-listening, and truth-telling. This is the moment. The moment of truth-seeking is the moment when you wade into the water. That's that water moment. And it is troubled. But it's in the seeking that you gain more of God. Because in the seeking, one must exercise humility, because humility says, I do not know all there is to know. I have need. I do not know what I need to know. And then the listening it's actually a spiritual practice. It is a spiritually formative practice of bowing to the image of God in the other. And the talking, the truth-telling, is the process of telling the truth that you have heard. Now, Jesus says, I am the truth. So when we cover over truth, we are covering over Jesus. When we erase truth, we are erasing Jesus from our lives. When we crush truth, we are crushing Jesus. And I think this is actually happening in a very real way. We are at the very least, pushing Jesus away from us, because truth is not always pretty. Truth interacts with us. We have to reckon with truth. And it is Jesus, it is the Spirit, it is God that makes us able to do so, that has the ability to come in and transform that ugly truth into something that is redeemed, into something that has the ability to do good in the world through our interaction with it. But if we refuse to reckon, then we are claiming the space of God. We are not allowing God to be God. Now the second movement in our symphony is the movement of reparation. Reparation is a biblical term. It comes straight out of the Bible. And in fact, I'm deeply informed by 2 Samuel 21, 1 through 14. In 2 Samuel, we see David hunched over in prayer. He's like, God, why is there a drought in the land? I don't know what's going on with this drought. Did I do something? Please help me to deal with this. My people are dying, God. And then he gets this brilliant idea. I don't know where it comes from. It literally doesn't say where it comes from. It's just kind of random and in the text. He calls the Gibeonites. Why does he call the Gibeonites? I think it might have been literally something he heard in prayer. Go call the Gibeonites. So he calls the Gibeonites. And when he does, they come, and they come prepared. They're like, Mr. David, we have a bone to pick with you. And he's like, okay, what's that? And they say, the previous king Saul, note, not him, previous king, Saul, tried to kill all of our people, and he wasn't supposed to do that. And David is like, he has this big aha moment. He's like, oh, that's why we have a famine in the land. So you know what he does? He does something that I can barely imagine our nation doing. Can you imagine our nation responding as David does? Now, David had a chance. He had a choice at this moment, much like our own founders did. He could have done justice light. He could have said, okay, I'll tell you what, I'm going to take my counsel and we'll figure out how to work this out for you, and gone back to the council. He didn't do that. He could have done what America has done to African Americans. Literally nothing. There has been no reparations, and we are the only group for whom reparations, no form of federal reparations has ever been paid. Why is that okay? Why is that okay? It's not okay. This is what he does. Instead, what he does, and I'm going to read it directly from the text, he says, what do you say that I should do for you, so that things will be made well? What do you say? You see, I think he did that. He did the third way, because in the asking, in the humility, in the bowing to the image of God in them, that was the first step of correcting the damage to the relationship that Saul did when Saul took on the mantle of God and determined the last days of the Gibeonites. Do you see that? You see? Reparation is only fundamentally about repairing the relationship, the relatedness. So in order to do it, you got to go back to the genesis of the break. You got to know how it broke and start there in the repairing of the relationship. And guess what? When he said, "What do you say?" they came with it. They already had their council meeting. They came prepared. And guess what? It was costly. But it was not eye for an eye, which in itself is very interesting. But it was costly. And what was David's response to their costly demand? He did it. No questions asked. Can you imagine if we in the United States of America said to the African American community, "What do you say needs to be done in order for things to be made well for you?" And then the U.S. Congress and the presidency did it. No questions asked. Friends, that is literally all that H.R. 40 is asking for. 40 years of submitting this piece of legislation from the mid-1980s that is only asking for a study to figure out what it would take for the Black community to be made well after the breaks. And they've never even made it to the floor in Congress, in the Senate. There have been many groups of African American leaders that have put together manifestos and visions and lists of what it would take. The only thing that is needed now is the political will, the will of the polis to make things well for the first time. Now the last movement in our symphony of repair is the movement of forgiveness that brings us to the beloved community. Now I need to take care here because this can be very, very misunderstood. I was in South Africa back in, I believe, 2018, and then again in 2019. And when I was there to spend 5 days on Robben Island. And while there, I was taken around the city by white South Afrikaners and also Black South Africans. And when they would talk to me about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and all that it did, they had very different responses to the forgiveness part, the amnesty part. The white South Africans were incredibly grateful, and they loved talking about it over lattes. The Black South Africans were in writhing pain because of that amnesty, there was not a sense now of a need to do reparations, to do restitution, which was one of the 3 pillars of the TRC that was never, the only pillar that was never done. And it's the reason why when you go to South Africa today, you still have de facto apartheid. You still have the Black townships and the colored townships. And you still have the gold-gilded garages of the white South Afrikaners who live in the hills with razor wire around their homes. You still have that because forgiveness was abused and misunderstood. So let me disavow us of abuse right now. Forgiveness, even according to Archbishop Desmond Tutu, was never for the sake of those who oppressed and benefited from oppression. It was never for their sake. It was not to release them. It wasn't just so that they would be able to go back and have a latte. It was for the sake of the oppressed. Because until there is a shift in who you are demanding right justice from, until there is a shift, in other words, if you are demanding justice from one who refuses to give it, or who can't give what is just. In other words, my own great-grandfather Hiram ran from Indiana, and because Indiana became a sundown state, really, but especially around Rockport in the turn of the 20th century, it was a sundown town. So he ran from Indiana up to Philadelphia, worked his way up in the post office, and eventually became a supervisor in the post office circa 1950s. And in the 1950s, bought up a bunch of land in this area called Elmwood, Philadelphia. Marshland, like my ancestors who lived in the swampland of Puerto Rico. It was marshland, but it was theirs. And so he had a whole block of homes. He had several homes on this one block. And he would use those homes to house people of African descent running from the terror of the South and the Great Migration. A whole community, black community, was built up in this area. And he was a leader among them. And then Philadelphia snatched the land by eminent domain. And he died that year. We believe of a broken heart. So if I were to demand that Philadelphia bring back the community of Elmwood that they broke up, I would die in a deficit. They can't. It's not possible. That community is gone. There are people who died as a result of race, the construct of race. They are not coming back. Now, if I were to demand something that cannot be given by those that I'm demanding it from, I am the one who suffers. But I can release them of the debt they owe me that they cannot repay, and then turn to God, the one who owns cattle on 1,000 hills, the one who changes the course of rivers and moves mountains. And I can say to God, God, it is your good pleasure to give to those who you call daughter and son, to your children. Ante up. And God would smile and give in God's own way. So forgiveness is the process of releasing the oppressor from that which they cannot give. They cannot or even refuse to give. And then turning to God to meet the actual need in our bodies and our souls and our families. It's really a process of repentance, of turning from those who we have called God, who we have depended on for all things because they told us to do that. And now, even in the injustice, they are holding on to that relationship by saying no and keeping us in want and in need and cutting that tie and going to God to get the need met. And saying to them, you can go now. Go. Now. Forgiveness. Forgiveness is a part of the healing. And being released for those of European descent in this context where colonization and enslavement are a part of the history, being released is a major part of your healing. Because in order to allow yourselves to be released, you have to allow yourselves to simply be human. The last page of my book, Fortune, people ask me often, what do you hope will come from this work? And I often take them to this page because it tells us what are we looking toward? There are two paths set before the oppressed. One path leads to rage, compounded pain, sickness, and death. The other leads to the beloved community. And on that road, there is truth-seeking, truth-listening, and truth-telling. There is reparation and equity, and there is mercy, release. And for the sake of my body and soul, and the bodies and souls of my family's descendants to the 10th generation from me, I choose the beloved community. Now, for readers in European bodies, you also have a choice. You can continue your war for supremacy against the image of God on earth. You can resist God's beloved community, resist truth, resist equity, resist justice, and resist mercy. You can try to maintain your space at the top of a crumbling racial hierarchy. You won't be there long. You're already in the global minority, and within one generation, you will be in the minority in the United States as well. And when that day comes, you can wage war, or you can lean into truth, lean into repentance, lean into repair, and allow yourselves to be released, forgiven. Only then, beloveds, can we find a new way of being together in the world. And I can almost hear my 7 times great-grandmother, Fortune Game McGee, who walked this land 10 generations ago, and absorbed the wrath of its first race, gender, and citizenship laws into her traumatized body. And in my mind's ear, I hear her whisper, "Yes, child, yes." Amen.
We're going to continue the conversation for a little bit longer. Robin is passing out 3x5 cards. If you have questions you would like to write down, we can't promise we're going to get everything answered, but we will try to start that conversation. And can they turn the screen off? Yeah, thanks. Thank you.
Yes.
As I said, I really enjoyed the book, and I really appreciated hearing your family story, and being that you were able to track down as much of it as you could when whiteness was trying to keep that story from being told. And you talked about fragmentation of families, the separation of families, the separation from your story, the separation from knowing things. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that is not something I have experienced in quite the same way, and I don't think a lot of people in white bodies know what that is.
Yeah, one of the ways that colonization worked, wherever it landed in the world, European colonization, was to separate the people groups and create this racial hierarchy of human belonging that then fragmented communities. But more even, beyond that, I think a really great illustration of this is Ancestry.com, their DNA it does magic in lots of different great ways. One of the things that it does is that it traces your DNA community. And for my mother's side of the family, it's traced our DNA community, the people who have the highest concentration of our DNA in them is right there in Virginia and the Eastern Shore of Maryland, where Fortune and the Fortune family were. So I was like, oh my gosh, there it is. There's the proof right there. It's part of the proof. But then on my father's side of the family, our DNA community is the Lesser Antilles. And then what they do is they can actually trace the moment that your ancestors arrived in that space. Like, what was the first wave of your ancestry's DNA in that space, the oldest DNA. And what they've traced for us in the Lesser Antilles is that the oldest DNA in our family line still is there in Barbados. And the highest concentration was in Barbados. So now, and it came circa 1750. But in 1750, they were coming from Nigeria mostly, most likely. And within one generation, within 20 years, you can see this on the Ancestry DNA map, in 20 years, one generation, we go from a high concentration, the largest bubble, and actually only a couple other bubbles other than that, in Barbados, to having our DNA spread to every island in the Lesser Antilles. You see what I'm saying? You hear what I'm saying, right? So we were sold. Our families were like shattered. One generation. So now I wonder why in our family, you know, on that line of the family, the weak side of the family, separation is like it's a pathology. People have no qualms about just not talking to people for years, cutting off that part of the family. Like, where did that come from? That came from somewhere. They learned that was normative and okay over time. And it started with slavocracy. So what is the fragmentation? The fragmentation of families, the fragmentation of communities, and then finally there's the fragmentation of identity, self-identity. And that comes with the legal constructs of race as they are being formed in the 19th century, especially in the 19th century. You see this most and clearest in the Lawrence story. In the Lawrence story, that's chapter 2, Henry and Harriet. You see them. They are, and they're still kind of an enigma to me, but now it's clear to me where we were told that Henry was part Cherokee and part black. Now it's clear, no, Henry was black and white. He was black and white. But his wife, Harriet, was most likely, in fact, she was very clearly Cherokee and white. So she had a mix in there too. But on the census, it's the census taker who then would tell the U.S. government what they were. So you see their designation change over the years just based on what the census taker wanted to do in terms of his power to define them. So in 1870, they are listed as mulatto. In 1880, they are listed as, I think, as black. And then as white, actually. Harriet is listed as white, and Henry is listed as mulatto. And then in 1900, Henry is listed as black, right? So you have this movement, and I was sharing with Marcy earlier that one of the lines of Henry's family, his brother's son, lists himself as Ethiopian on the 1900 census. We're like, we know you are not Ethiopian. We know who you are. What are you doing? But they were trying to define themselves. And at that moment, when he listed himself as Ethiopian, there was a revolution happening in Ethiopia, and they were throwing off the oppressor that had come in and colonized them. So wasn't that something? African Americans literally identified with Ethiopia and said, I'm one of them in the 1900s, and that's one of my ancestors. So the fragmentation of identity, the fragmentation of family, it fragmented, it crushed our sense of belonging in the world. And that is, I think, when you belong, you have peace. Because that's what we were created for. We were created for connection. Literally, on the first page of the Bible, shalom is about the radical connectedness of all things. So what happens when you are disconnected? That's what the system of slavocracy did to a whole people group. And also the same is true for indigenous peoples. Disconnected them from their lands and their families with mission schools and genocide and removals and trails of tears. So the modus operandi of domination was fragmentation.
and is still.
And is.
I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. And, you see it, what's happening here, but I mean, you see it in Florida with the African American Studies AP classes that they're not allowing to have happen. Or I was also reading this week about African American History Month, but what they're teaching is of lynching and things that continue to re-traumatize Black students as opposed to the stories of their people, right? I mean,
Right.
it's still.
What they do, and this is actually something I've learned, is that another modus operandi of colonization, and by colonization I'm talking little c colonization, right? The act of dominating and extracting for resources. That's what little c colonization is. The prevalent modus operandi for it is to focus the attention. If you're going to tell anything, you focus the attention on that which will support your cause, and you erase the stories that will challenge your cause. And that's what's happening in Florida right now and around the country.
Another thing I appreciated about this book is the truth seeking and listening and telling part as the intro to reparations, and because I think it's such a huge, it can feel like such a big task, and in that sense, and there's a couple questions in here about like, how do we begin? And I think that was a very helpful kind of framework that you gave us as an entry into it. And you pointed out in the book that had the 40 acres and a mule actually happened after the Civil War, we wouldn't be having this conversation about that today, right?
There'd be no need.
Where there's so many points in history. I kept thinking about that when you kept talking, so many points where we could have made different decisions, right? But now we're at the place where we can't change those decisions. What are the decisions that we can make? And somebody asked about how we can do an opening into reparations. What are if we can't chew the whole elephant today, what are the beginnings?
Oh, honestly, it's a great question. And I want to say, first of all, reparations is it needs to be understood fundamentally as a government act. Because it is the government, it is us as United States of America, the United States of America, and the colonies that actually seeded us. And I think we can actually even take responsibility as America, as the United States of America, even for those first race laws, because we didn't reverse them. We chose to keep them and entrench them and even make them worse after we became the United States of America. 3/5 compromise came after the Revolutionary War, right? So when it comes to the question of how do we begin to repair, you need to be advocating for H.R. 40. You need to be advocating for the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Act that is still caught in committee in the House. These two pieces of legislation, and now there's actually a plethora of smaller pieces, little bite-sized pieces of legislation, like the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, that these little pieces put together would actually make reparations, and they actually do equal if all put together, the sum total of all that everybody's saying needs to happen in reparation. So we need to be advocating for all of those things that is coming from the communities that were oppressed and saying, this is what we need. Do them. Do them. Now, that is true. And yet, we cannot wait. We cannot wait for the federal government to finally get a conscience and also for the perfect, and in this case, it would really have to be a fully democratic government that is going to make that happen. It would need to be both houses of Congress. It would need to be the presidency, and we would also eventually need to have a flip in the Supreme Court as well, right? So in order to make this stick. But that said, We can't wait for that. So what you can do, and what people are doing all over the country, is you can act in your local area. You can call for reparations in your city. You can call for reparations in your state, which is actually happening here in California. And I don't know the degree to which it's happening here in San Francisco, but it can happen here. And then on a micro level, you can actually begin the work of reparation here as a church community. You can begin to ask the hard questions of whose land am I actually on? You can ask the question, you gave beautiful acknowledgement of the first people of this land as we began. The next step would be to go to the council meeting of those people, begin to build relationship with that nation here on this land, and get to know. Don't just go and ask in your first meeting with them, but get to know what are the things they are fighting for. And then come alongside them and fight for the things that matter to them. And also ask them, as I actually know that there's a church in Los Angeles that is doing this. They have gone to the first people of the land in Pasadena. I don't mind saying it's All Saints Church in Pasadena has gone to the first people of the land in Pasadena, and they have asked them, what do you say it will take for things to be made well with you? And they are now waiting to hear back from the tribe, from the nation. And they will do it. They have committed to do it. So what would it look like for Calvary to make that kind of an act? To do the work, yourselves do the work of repairing what was broken, repairing the relationships that were broken, the right relatedness. Part of what that looks like, well, fundamental what that looks like is the recognition and the bowing to the image of God in the ones who had the image of God in them denied and erased previously. That's what it looks like to reverse, to repair, to simply begin to do well, to walk right with them. And then allow God to be God. Don't hold on to your stuff. Allow God to hold on to it for you. Allow God to move them, to be creative in different ways. So often we don't do these acts because we're afraid of loss. But what we fail to recognize is that actually we would gain so much more.
Yeah.
So much more.
Yeah.
What is it to gain the whole world if you lose your soul?
Right. Yeah. Thank you. For those of you who are part of Calvary's community, or actually all of you are invited to this, but next Sunday on the 19th after worship, we will be having a class where a church historian from San Francisco Theological Seminary will be here and share a little bit about the history of slavery in the Presbyterian Church broadly and at Calvary, and with Calvary's history specifically. So we hope that you can all come to that as we learn a little bit more about that story as well.
Say one last thing here is that in this context in San Francisco, you are living a white black and a white Asian and a white Native American and a white Latino history here. And I think that what ends up happening, oftentimes where things get confused on the West Coast, is that what ends up happening is you end up having a competition for oppression, the oppression Olympics, right? Who was oppressed more in this space and where, and I think part of it also comes from a misunderstanding of race itself. Because in this context, it worked differently because it has a different history than on the East Coast, which was mainly black, white, and white Native American. But one thing that needs to be understood as you are engaging this question of the racialization of this land is that while the histories are different, particularly when we're talking about who colonized whom here, it was the Spanish here who were actually the conquistadores who enslaved Native Americans, put them in missions, and then also created these governments. But ultimately, it was still the English who won. And right now, it is the English lineage that traces back and is governing the oppression of all on this land. So it happened with the Japanese during Japanese internment. That wasn't the Spanish, that was the white folk who did that. The same with the Treaty of Burlingame and the Chinese Exclusion Act and all. That wasn't the Spanish, that was the white folk who did that, right? And the same with Filipinos. The history here, while goes back deep, and all of that needs to be dealt with. The policies and the structures that are built right now that are governing life are governed by white supremacy. And it's political white supremacy. So if you focus there, if you focus as a community, as a multi-ethnic community, coming from all these different spaces on how did the supremacy of the political supremacy of whiteness impact my people group, that is how you will be able to move forward in this really mosaic of a state in a way that begins to dismantle the hegemony of whiteness. That's the goal. That's the goal.
Thank you. I also was thinking while you were talking, there was a woman murdered here this week in East Bay, the East Bay, whose family has come out and said that they don't want, if her attackers are caught, they don't want them to face the political criminalization structure. They want reparation.
Wow.
For justice for her. That it wouldn't be justice for her if they just become incarcerated. And it occurred to me that that's both a micro and a macro level kind of work toward reparation too, right? Trying to, in the sense of repair, trying to repair their lives so that that doesn't continue and
and restore their right relationship with the rest of community. And I have to say that San Francisco is actually leading the country on this. They have, maybe even a decade ago, started alternative courts that would actually bring communities together to determine how to repair the relationship of one who sinned against, for lack of better terminology right now, sinned against their community. The community now will decide how to welcome them back in. What do they need to do to make things right? That is revolutionary. That's what it looks like. That's what reparative justice looks like, as opposed to punitive justice, which is what we are so used to.
Right, and I think the truth is, as you figure it out, it's messy. And I think we're in the messy phase. Is that fair, San Francisco? We're in the messy phase of that. And I think that, to talk about going into the water, right? I think there are people who are like, nope, let's just get right back out of the water. Let's go back to what we know. But you can't get across the river if you
You'll
don't
never
keep
get
going.
north if you stop.
Yeah.
You just won't.
Yeah.
You'll never get north if you stop.
Yeah. So again, please help me thank Lisa. Thank you so much. Thank you. And we hope that you can join us for a reception. There is plenty of food, drinks, and books to be sold. So thank you.
Yes. And I'll be signing.
And she'll sign.